Well, I wonder how much can Orbán change the direction of the EU? Because in recent years, the European Union has grown more sceptical of China. There's taken a tougher attitude over things like they've wanted to reduce economic dependence on China. There's been disagreements over what they see as China's record on human rights and also Taiwan. Could Hungary start a shift within the EU over attitudes towards China, do you think, Brian?
I think it depends. It's a good question. However, I don't really see major changes. I think really the major powers in the EU will stick to their existing ideologies. And I think in terms of how Hungary has positioned itself, let's say as compared to Czechia or Lithuania, it actually does reflect differing historical viewpoints on the Cold War. And that plays into how one understands the present, in which NATO is present in Europe. And then there's this contention regarding Russia. So I actually don't expect that to really change. It is possible it does create more wiggle room, though, because, as was mentioned, there are pro-Russia politicians in the countries in Europe. Even in Ukraine, for example, there was the pro-Russia political bloc, and they were in power before. And so I think it actually does help to remember that many of these countries are divided. And this figures into the domestic political debate in these countries as well, what their stance on Russia is versus or relative to the EU and NATO and Western European countries or the US behind this.
Yeah, so it's quite incredible, really, that with all these domestic debates going on within each country in the EU, you have the rest of the EU sort of standing on one side and Orbán on his own over there, it seems. So as well as his trip in July to various countries, we also saw in the same month the European Parliament elect Ursula von der Leyen for another 5 years as the president of the executive, the European Commission. And in a speech before she was re-elected, she said that she would seek to deter China from invading Taiwan. Some see this as her clearest stance yet on countering China and supporting Taiwan. And she also spoke about how the EU would, under her, cooperate with Japan, South Korea, New Zealand and Australia to jointly face challenges posed by China. Max, what future assistance do you think realistically the EU can give Asia and specifically Taiwan?
I have to be very honest. In military way, it's very limited because the EU, they don't have military power that belong to NATO. So in military way, what they can do is very limited. So we can imagine why you use assistance. Because Taiwan is so small and China is so big. How can we defend China by our own self? Of course, we need the help from outside of the world. And consider the fact that until now, the EU, they won't sign the BIA, the trade, the investment agreement with Taiwan. And the only reason is still consider about China's reaction. So the best way to help Taiwan or Asia is we help ourselves first. We need to be confident that Taiwan is important not only to ourselves, but also to whole the world. It's not only geopolitical, but also for the chip or for the AI. So for all this, I think both sides, including Taiwan and the EU, we need to invest in each other. Consider that the EU is the biggest Taiwan's partner, but Taiwan, we invest the EU very limited. So I think first we need to consider ourselves. We need to increase our investment in Europe first.
Brian, what do you think if we look at what von der Leyen said? Beijing reacted strongly to her words. A Chinese foreign ministry official called it gross interference in China's affairs and said playing with fire on Taiwan is highly dangerous. So if the EU does draw closer to Taiwan, if it expresses more vocal support at least, if it's not capable of military support or even economic investment, what can Beijing do about this, do you think?
It's a good question, because I think particularly, again, Taiwan is what Beijing would like to frame as its red line. And so here, China is attempting to send a signal. But this is not new to the EU or any other country in the world either. Just reiterating many of the same messages. I think the question is, what strategies will the EU take? And I think that compared to the US, for example, under Donald Trump or a future, perhaps second Trump presidency, it might be a less flashy approach in terms of, for example, allowing for some visits or some trade agreements, but then not doing it in a way that leads to strong reactions from China, because China does react when there's symbolic means of support sometimes that may not have economic backing, but perhaps there are ways to do it more quietly and support Taiwan in that way. That itself is a debate in the US, and it's interesting to see when that occurs regarding how European countries can also show support for Taiwan. But I think that China is expected to react angrily regardless of what occurs.
I mean, really, can it do anything else apart from react angrily? Is it all bluster? What else has it got in its toolbox at the moment?
I think a lot of it's optics, the wolf warrior diplomacy and so forth, though China sometimes does try to dial that back. It's unlikely then China would undercut economic agreements over this. Military threats, that's also not likely to happen. So it's more, I think, likely to be noise, but it depends on what tenor it takes. And I think one might see more wolf warrior diplomacy around major international events, particularly if it does put Taiwan in the spotlight.